January 17, 1943. Dawn breaks pale across a scorched stretch of North African desert, the orange sun rising slow behind a jagged line of armored vehicles. A crunch of boots disturbs the silence as a German Afrika Korps reconnaissance party navigates the brittle skeleton of a battlefield. From a distance, it looks like any other relic abandoned by fleeing Allied forces, until the senior technical officer gestures sharply. Welded steel glints beneath a thin veneer of sand. Bring up the mechanics, the order echoes curt in the chilly air. They crowd the find, form huddled shadows around its squat, mysterious frame. An American Willys MB Jeep captured almost intact. The smell of hot metal, cordite, and spilled fuel hangs heavy, a scent every man here knows, yet this morning it carries a note of unease, of novelty, of something unexpected. Time seems to compress. The desert wind carries whispers of a larger truth, one that will soon become impossible to ignore or deny. In those first moments, the Jeep is only an object, a puzzle among ruined trucks and shattered grease tins. To these German mechanics, products of a culture that reveres precision, handcraft, the beautiful machinery of Mercedes and Maybach, American hardware is typically derided as crude. Most expect to find another fragile curiosity, built for a careless army flush with resources. They mutter jokes under their breath, remarks about American impatience and poor engineering, quips that suggest this vehicle might prove mechanically inferior to German designs. But as wrenches turn and hoods are lifted, derision falters. Wires are color-coded in red, black, and yellow. Bolts and latches are stamped with instructions. Instructions. Simple, clear, unmistakable instructions in a design that assumes the mechanic might be anyone, might have limited training, might need guidance. The engine, a squat 2.2-liter block of 134 cubic inches, bristles with simplicity. No elaborate tools, no cryptic fastenings, no mysteries designed to preserve a monopoly on knowledge. Just a robust, accessible heart designed for war's blunt realities. One man finds a spare spark plug taped beside the engine block. Another flips open a grease cup and discovers it's labeled, in English and Russian. Not one language for one nation, but two, as if the Americans anticipated this vehicle might one day serve allies they haven't yet named. Within a half hour, their skepticism is replaced with grudging professional respect, tinged with a growing, uncomfortable awe. The Jeep's four-wheel drive system is intuitive and nearly idiot-proof, engaging with a simplicity that speaks to something the Germans have never quite grasped: the philosophy of adequacy multiplied by abundance. In contrast, the German Kübelwagen, more elegant and comfortable to drive on roads, a triumph of Porsche's design genius, lacks the bite to claw its way through the deep sand. It moves on rear-wheel drive alone, a choice made for efficiency on European roads, but a fatal limitation in this theater of war. One mechanic remarks under his breath that, for all its aesthetic sins, the American design looks unfailingly, almost insultingly, practical. Another senior engineer, a man named Klaus Reinhardt, who once designed engines for Daimler-Benz before the war, conscripted his skills, studies the component assembly with the intensity of a man confronting something that challenges not just his technical understanding, but his entire worldview. The Jeep operates on a principle he has heard whispered in hushed conversations at automotive conferences: standardization. Every part is designed to fit 1,000 other machines. Every bolt could be duplicated at any factory. The design philosophy seems almost to mock German craftsmanship, suggesting that what Germany has celebrated as a virtue, precision engineering, might actually be a vulnerability in total war. That revelation marks more than a mechanical awakening. It is the first crack in a myth that has sustained German morale through countless setbacks, because for months, for years, from Stalingrad to El Alamein, the Wehrmacht has been schooled in the gospel of German superiority. By wit and will, by technical brilliance and the discipline of the German people, German engineering cannot be matched. History propaganda has insisted belongs to the Aryan race, to the disciplined order of Prussian tradition, to the marriage of craft and ideology that defines the new Germany. Now here in the desert dust is proof otherwise. The small placard on the dashboard reads Willys MB, a name that means nothing to these men. But the stir among these mechanics is born not of envy alone, but genuine shock, the kind of shock that precedes an intellectual reckoning. This was not supposed to happen. A simple utilitarian vehicle, mass-produced by a democracy these men have been taught to despise, should not outshine the careful work of German engineering. Yet it does. Perhaps one of them thinks but does not say. Perhaps the Americans understand something about industrial warfare that the theorists in Berlin do not. In Berlin, years before this encounter, Adolf Hitler's planners reasoned that few armies could afford such machines in quantity. The Kübelwagen, the bucket seat car, was a technical marvel in its own way, light and fuel efficient, born from the same Porsche design team that would later create the Tiger tank. With nearly 55,000 built during the entire war, it represents a respectable achievement in engineering under constraint. But by 1943, over 640,000 Jeeps had rolled forth from America's rivers of steel. 640,000. The ratio is stark and mathematically crushing. 12 Jeeps for every Kübelwagen. 12 to 1. 1 Jeep for every 300 Americans. Not a luxury, but a symbol, almost a birthright available to quartermasters and commanders, to reconnaissance units and supply convoys. For every mechanized infantry squad there were replacements waiting in depots stretching from North Africa to the Soviet Union. Why do these numbers matter? Because war, despite the romance of heroism, despite the legends of tactical brilliance that will be told in memoirs and military academies, relies on cold calculation. Gasoline, engines, hours of operation, replacements, spare parts, the logistics of maintaining machinery under combat conditions. Soldiers on all sides believed fiercely in the virtues of their nation's machines, yet the German order of battle, for all its technical brilliance, moved on constraint and assumptions of scarcity. Every panzer tank was engineered to extraordinary standards, but Germany could produce fewer than 3 tanks for every tank America manufactured. American planners, under the guiding hand of men like George Marshall, and the logistical wizardry of Detroit's automakers, Henry Ford, the Dodge brothers, the engineers at Willys Overland, embraced abundance as a strategy. The Jeep, built on hundreds of thousands of identical parts, assembled by men and women from Ohio to New Jersey, by former automobile workers who understood the vocabulary of mass production like native speakers, became the test case, the physical proof that the Allied approach was fundamentally different and perhaps even superior to the German way. By the end of 1942, the German High Command is forced to grapple with a reality that remains unspoken in official propaganda. For every German field car, the Allies could field an entire fleet, with replacements already in the pipeline and spare parts awaiting in crates that sprawl across every depot from Algiers to Archangel. The implications extend beyond mere mathematics. In 1941, before America's full mobilization, Ford Motor Company had manufactured 691,000 automobiles for civilian consumption in a single year. That figure alone exceeds all of German automobile production for the entire war. By 1944, American factories would produce 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The Jeep represented just one piece of this incomprehensible abundance. Military trucks in numbers that German quartermasters could not count without exhaustion. Aircraft that seemed to multiply despite German efforts to shoot them down. Ammunition in quantities that suggested an infinite supply. One captured Wehrmacht officer would later write in a post-war memoir, "We were not defeated by German inferiority. We were defeated by American arithmetic." This realization haunted the soul of the Wehrmacht like a specter that could not be exorcised. It did not come in one shock, but accumulated through a long, painful series of small humiliations, each one reinforcing the larger truth. Mechanics in the Afrika Korps writing home to say, in careful letters censored by staff officers, that the Americans value their engines too cheaply. Officers watching Jeep convoys splash through wadis, pull stuck tanks from the mud with nothing more than a rope and 4-wheel drive, then roar away before a single mortar round is landed. Supply sergeants noting that captured American vehicles came with spare parts, manuals, and maintenance schedules, as if the Americans anticipated loss and designed for replacement. One letter, later found among the personal effects of a captured Feldwebel named Ernst Bauer, read, "These cars come out of nowhere, swarm like ants, vanish before we can capture more than a handful. When we repair our few Kübelwagen, we pray no parts fail because Berlin cannot send replacements. Yet the Americans throw away damaged Jeeps and drive new ones the next day. We are losing a war of mathematics we cannot win. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 would provide a devastating illustration of this imbalance. American forces, raw and not yet blooded in heavy combat, faced Rommel's Afrika Korps in a clash near the Grand Dorsal Mountains of Tunisia. In the initial engagements, American artillery was hampered by inadequate supply lines. German panzers broke through American positions. But when the Americans pulled back and regrouped, something became apparent. They had more. More trucks, more ammunition, more replacement vehicles, more men to crew them. The Jeep did not win the battle directly. That was the work of artillery and armor. But it enabled the supply lines that made sustained resistance possible. By February 24th, the Axis force had withdrawn, not because they were militarily defeated, but because they were outstretched. Their supply lines stretched thin by a Wehrmacht that simply could not manufacture enough light vehicles to sustain momentum against an enemy that was learning to use abundance as a weapon. In the months following Kasserine, the symbolism only grows. German commando units, sent behind Allied lines in Operation Greif during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, painstakingly gather every Jeep they can find. Special commandos under the legendary SS officer Otto Skorzeny request authority to requisition American vehicles for infiltration missions. Men dressed in captured uniforms, driving captured Jeeps, speaking English learned in American POW camps, spreading confusion and gathering intelligence behind Allied lines. Despite Hitler's personal interest in the operation and direct orders giving Skorzeny nearly unlimited authority, his men managed to acquire only 30 Jeeps, a fraction of the hundreds requested. In desperation, German engineers attempt to copy captured Jeeps, but the process is slow, complicated by the need to design new tooling, to source rare materials. The lesson is cruelly clear. American excess defeats German cunning. Even imitation yields diminishing returns when the originals are so numerous as to become almost anonymous in the landscape of war. One captured SS officer would later tell American intelligence officers, "We could capture 100 Jeeps and Skorzeny would have them the next day." But after 100, he would send for 100 more, and for 100 more after that, and still the Americans would field thousands more. We were trying to outmaneuver infinity. General George C. Marshall, the quiet, relentless mind behind American mobilization, the man who rose from infantry captain in 1917 to become the architect of Allied victory, calls the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. This is no casual praise. Marshall has seen every weapon system, studied every technology, examined every innovation. Yet this utility vehicle, this unglamorous machine, receives his highest honor. Eisenhower, who will one day become president and will preside over the entire modern military-industrial complex, adds the Jeep to his short list of the 4 weapons that truly won the war: the C-47 transport aircraft, the bazooka anti-tank weapon, the atomic bomb, and the Jeep. 4 items. 1 is a symbol of strategic bombing and nuclear deterrence. 1 is the basic anti-armor weapon that democratized tank killing. 1 is the logistical miracle that enabled airborne operations. And 1 is a quarter-ton truck. But to the German soldier cowering in a pillbox or freezing amid the snowdrifts of Belgium, or dying from dysentery in an African field hospital where supplies never arrived, the symbolism is even starker. The Jeep's low driving hum becomes the soundtrack of Allied victory. It is the note in the air that signals another supply drop, another advance, another day survived by those challenging fate's odds. The sound of a Jeep approaching is the sound of hope to a wounded American soldier, the sound of dread to a German one. This symbolism is not fiction, not propaganda or post-war invention. It is written into diaries and official reports, documented in captured letters and intelligence assessments. POWs at Camp Hearn, Texas, a facility designed to hold German prisoners of war and put them to work in the American war effort, conscripted to sweep American vehicle yards clean, to repair and maintain the endless stream of machines, recount in later memoirs and oral histories the shock of abundance that became almost unbearable. One POW, a mechanic from Bremen named Wilhelm Kotz, writes, "I was allowed to repair a Jeep one day and watched the American sergeant discard a perfectly good tire because it was scratched. At home we would have chopped it into shoes for our children. Here they offer it to anyone passing by without a second thought. I realized then that we had lost the war, not in battle but in economics. We were enemies of a nation that could afford to waste what we desperately needed. Interviews conducted decades later with surviving German POWs reveal the astonishment was sharp and lasting, a wound that never quite healed in the German psyche. Meals arrived in quantities that seemed impossible. Meat, vegetables, bread, all provided in excess and indifference. Beds with clean sheets, showers with hot water, medical care that did not discriminate between prisoners and guards. Friedrich Müller, a captured corporal who had fought in North Africa and survived 2 years of captivity, tells how his work in a Texas canning plant left him haunted for the rest of his life. We destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit because it did not meet canning standards. Peaches, apricots, pears, all destroyed. Fruit that would have been treasure in Germany, that would have been rationed carefully and distributed to school children, is garbage here. They compost it. An entire truckload of food composted daily. I wept the first time I saw it. I wept because I understood that no amount of German courage or German brilliance could overcome this. We were fighting a nation that was literally burying food because it was imperfect. In North Africa, at the battered oasis outposts near Kasserine, and along the edges of the vast supply depots that marked the boundary between the German and Allied zones, officers like Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, a veteran of the Afrika Korps and later a historian of German military operations, find themselves surrounded by row after row of fuel drums abandoned by retreating Americans. One depot alone holds 57,000 gallons, more gasoline than his entire division receives from Germany in 2 months. To comprehend this is to comprehend the war itself. German supply lines stretch across thousands of miles of desert and sea, across the Mediterranean where Allied aircraft hunt their convoys, across supply roads where British SAS raids attack at night. Every gallon of fuel must be carefully hoarded, rationed, calculated. The Panzer divisions operate on careful schedules, moving only when fuel consumption can be justified, fighting carefully to preserve every reserve. And yet the Americans, when forced to retreat, leave behind enough fuel to sustain German operations for weeks. What kind of enemy possesses such abundance that they can afford to abandon it? Mellenthin writes in his memoirs, a book that will later become required reading in German military academies. This moment revealed a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Tactics matter, leadership matters, courage matters, but in the end, industrial capacity is destiny. The side with more factories wins, not the side with better generals. The mathematics of this truth become increasingly visible as the war grinds onward. By 1943, German automobile production has begun to decline as factories are retooled for tanks and aircraft. The Volkswagen factory, originally intended to mass-produce the people's car, the KDF wagon that would later become the Beetle, never produced a single civilian automobile during the war. Instead, it manufactures 50,000 Kübelwagen and begins work on amphibious variants and half-tracks. Germany's entire automotive industry, considered world-class before the war, can produce only a fraction of what American factories generate routinely. When German engineers calculate the production rates of American factories, the figures seem almost fictional. Willys Overland alone produces more Jeeps than Germany produces all types of vehicles combined. Ford manufactures not just Jeeps but also trucks, engines, and components. Dodge, Chevrolet, International. The list of American manufacturers pouring military vehicles into the war effort is staggering. By 1945, when the final accounting is made, America will have produced over 2,800 tanks, along with countless trucks, jeeps, and support vehicles. Germany, constrained by raw materials, by bombing, by the fundamental limitations of its manufacturing base, will produce fewer tanks and a fraction of the vehicles America manufactures. As the Jeep spreads across Europe, first appearing in North Africa, then in Sicily and Italy, then in vast numbers after D-Day, the emotional contrast sharpens for German soldiers. Officers reared on tales of tactical brilliance and technical precision find themselves outpaced, outmaneuvered, and ultimately humbled by a host of squat, utilitarian machines driven by soldiers who seem to treat them as expendable. The Jeep is not glamorous. It does not gleam in parade formation like the polished vehicles of the Wehrmacht's motor pools. It is dust-covered, dented, practical, but its very ubiquity, its indifferent presence in every scene of combat becomes a demoralizing force. For every roadblock destroyed, a new Jeep appears. For every road mined by German engineers, Americans simply drive across a field. their four-wheel drive finding purchase where wheeled vehicles from other nations would become hopelessly bogged. For every American patrol ambushed, replacements arrive within hours as if the supply line is infinite. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineers appeared with portable bridging equipment carried on jeeps, wrote one frustrated observer in early 1945. A German staff officer who would survive the war and document his observations in a book published after the conflict ended. The transformation wrought by this phenomenon was not simply tactical. It was intellectual, a shattering of the German soldier's assumptions about his own country, his adversary, and the world's future. If ideology and devotion alone could not overcome the arithmetic of Detroit, what did that say about the crumbling model of German supremacy? The question begins to poison morale in ways that more defeats might not. A soldier can accept losing a battle, but losing because the enemy has more is an affront to something deeper. At a 1998 reunion of Afrika Korps veterans, now men in their 70s and 80s, the mood is one of bitter nostalgia and reluctant admiration. They gather in a beer hall in Munich. These survivors, these old men who carried rifles across the sands of North Africa and saw things in war that changed them forever. "We never had anything like this," one old mechanic murmurs, his weathered hands trembling as he touches the hood of a preserved Willys, a vehicle identical to the ones he saw over 50 years ago. Not in numbers, not in spirit, not in the philosophy behind them. The Germans built machines for perfection. The Americans built machines for victory. And victory, we learned, is achieved through abundance, not precision. Yet the Jeep's symbolism deepened in ways the Americans themselves could not anticipate, in ways that transformed the nature of the post-war world. In the POW camps scattered across America, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Forest in Tennessee, dozens of other facilities holding hundreds of thousands of German soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe, German prisoners watched as their captors staged stock car races for entertainment, destroying working vehicles simply for the thrill of speed and spectacle. Vehicles that could have been refurbished for the war effort were instead driven in circles at high speed until they could no longer operate, then discarded. Heinz Weber, once an orderly in the Afrika Korps, later a businessman in post-war Germany, confided in his diary, 8 automobiles destroyed in one afternoon for entertainment. 8. My brother died in the Falaise pocket when his company ran out of fuel. He died because we didn't have enough vehicles because we couldn't manufacture them quickly enough. And here the Americans destroy 8 in an afternoon for fun. That's when I understood we had lost. Not because we were outfought, but because we challenged a nation that could afford to waste resources on a scale we couldn't comprehend. The waste itself was a weapon. This was more than mere abundance shock, though that phrase captures something essential. It was a form of psychological demolition, a shattering of worldview that would require years of reflection to process. The American Jeep was not just a product. It was a process. It was the visible manifestation of a system of production, of standardization, of the faith that good enough, when multiplied by the millions, defeats perfect, when constrained by scarcity. Its value, real and imagined, was determined not by its worth to any one man, but by its very disposability. A Jeep could be broken and replaced without thought. This seemed to the German mind almost obscene, a violation of the proper relationship between man and machine. Yet it was precisely this attitude that enabled American victory. That is the lesson that would linger long after the gunfire stopped, that would reshape German thinking about production, about engineering, about the proper relationship between industrial capacity and military power. The resonance of this encounter extended far into peacetime, shaping the future in ways that few could predict in 1945. German engineers, returned from American captivity, brought home with them a new faith in standardization, duplication, the virtues of production at scale. Men like Klaus Reinhardt, the Daimler-Benz engineer who examined that first captured Jeep in 1943, would after the war become influential figures in West German manufacturing. We had built for the select few, he would remember in an interview conducted in 1952. The Mercedes-Benz was a masterpiece, a triumph of German engineering. But it was expensive, complex, difficult to repair, and produced in small numbers. The Americans built for the millions. They built vehicles that anyone could maintain, using parts that anyone could understand. Their philosophy seemed crude to us. seemed to lack the elegance we prided ourselves on. But they were right and we were wrong. German superiority in engineering was actually German limitation disguised as virtue. Motor pool files from POW camps across America reveal how the lessons learned in captivity, color-coded wires, modular components, the philosophy of good enough, became gospel for the rebuilding of West Germany. Management techniques evolved. Skepticism of democracy faded. Even the most cynical found themselves imitating not just American products, but American outlook. The Wirtschaftswunder, the famed economic miracle of the 1950s, bore the fingerprints of these transformations. Abundance, not scarcity. Pragmatism, not perfection. When Volkswagen began to design the Beetle for mass production in the post-war era, the engineers consciously adopted American manufacturing principles. Interchangeable parts, standardized design, the faith that quantity, properly managed, could achieve quality. The company that had produced the Kübelwagen in 55,000 units would later produce millions of Beetles using techniques learned in American captivity. The Soviet Union, receiving 50,000 Jeeps through Lend-Lease, understood this principle immediately. When Stalin was offered a choice of military supplies by American diplomats in 1941, he lit up at the mention of Jeeps. "This is a war of motors," he reportedly said. "It is impossible to have too many of them, and the side having the largest number of motors is bound to win." Stalin understood what the German high command could not quite accept, that victory in modern war is achieved through the accumulation of adequacy, not the perfection of individual systems. The Soviet Union would eventually develop its own Jeep equivalent, the Gaz-67, and later would adopt mass production techniques that owed more to American automotive industry than to traditional Soviet planning. The Jeep in this way became not just a vehicle but a teacher, spreading lessons about production, standardization, and the relationship between industrial capacity and military power across the entire post-war world. In Europe, American Jeeps continued to arrive in vast numbers after D-Day. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that supplied advancing American forces after the Normandy breakout, relied partly on Jeeps for reconnaissance, for officer transport, for the 1,000 small logistical tasks that sustained military operations. Nearly 6,000 trucks operated in the system at its peak, carrying about 12,500 tons of supplies per day. But more than the trucks, it was the Jeeps that became iconic, the visible symbol of American supply power. Every division had dozens. Every corps had hundreds. They were seen bouncing across fields, roaring down roads, appearing and disappearing, with the casual frequency of insects. German soldiers, seeing them, understood that the war was lost. It was not a conclusion born of a single battle or a single defeat. It was born of the accumulated weight of witnessing abundance day after day, in a form so casual and matter-of-fact that it could only seem like a natural expression of American power rather than an achievement requiring any particular effort. So what? In the end, did the Jeep represent to the soldier, the prisoner, the survivor? It became more than a mode of transport, more than a vehicle designed to carry 4 soldiers and half a ton of equipment across difficult terrain. The Jeep, through those war years, was bread to the hungry, shelter to the weary, progress to the hopeful. For the American soldier, it was a lifeline, a connection to the supply system that meant he would eat, would receive ammunition, would be evacuated if wounded. Its engine's staccato hum became the pulse of liberation, of democracy carried on rubber tires, of freedom expressed through the simple fact of material abundance. For the Americans, it was a symbol of home, a companion that outlasted odds and outdrove fear. Veterans would later speak of the Jeep with a tenderness they reserved for few other machines. One officer would write, "The Jeep was more faithful to us than many men. It carried us through the worst moments of the war and seemed to understand that we were fighting for something worth fighting for." For the German, the Jeep was something altogether different. It was at first a puzzle, an object of professional curiosity, evidence of American technical capability that challenged German assumptions. Then it became a nemesis, a symbol of an enemy's seemingly infinite resources. Finally, belatedly and painfully, it became a teacher, forcing Germans to confront truths about themselves and their enemies that would require an entire generation to process. The encounter with the Jeep forced German engineers and thinkers to acknowledge that excellence in engineering was not the same as excellence in war. that perfection was not the same as victory, that the right production philosophy could matter more than technical brilliance. This was a painful lesson, and it would take decades to fully absorb it. But it would ultimately reshape German thinking about production, about technology, about the proper relationship between industrial capacity and national power. The years have drawn a soft patina over the surviving Jeeps. Now museum pieces or parade relics displayed in military museums across America and Europe. Clouds settle gently where once the air hummed with war. Many of the men who drove them are gone, their stories preserved in interviews and memoirs, their experiences fading into history. But listen, and under the static of memory you may still hear the restless wheels on North African sand, the faint engine murmur across European fields, the heartbeat of a time when the fate of nations was decided not by genius alone, not by courage alone, not by ideology or willpower, but by the thunderous prodigal promise of abundance. The Jeep endures, not merely as metal and mechanics, but as an idea, that freedom, like fertile soil under our feet, blooms when sown in the soil of plenty, built by many hands, driven by all, available to all. It is a democratic idea, perhaps the most democratic idea the American military ever produced. An idea that changed not just one war, but the entire post-war world. An idea that, in its simple four-wheel drive genius, taught the world that industrial power and moral power might not be the same thing, but that industrial power could certainly amplify moral power, could make it manifest, could give it teeth and wheels and the capacity to reach every corner of a battlefield. The Jeep did that, and in doing so it changed history.